we are officially opening the 11th Global Investigative Journalism Conference. Have a blast. Thank you. With that, let's start the first session. When we begin organizing these conferences, my first call is to this young lady trying to get up on stage. What are you doing, Sheila? This is Sheila Coronel, the academic dean of the Columbia Journalism Graduate School. My dear old friend, founder of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, one of the true pioneers, the woman who figured out how to take this model of nonprofit investigative journalism to a developing country right after the Marcos dictatorship and change forever the politics of the Philippines. You're in good hands. Sheila, I turn this over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask our panel to please come up on stage? Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for doing your work, for shining the torch of watchdog journalism on the world. I am privileged to be the moderator of this opening panel with a... We lack one more chair. I did the counting, I'm sorry. I don't know how to count. Why don't you sit here, Catherine, and I'll stand up so we can get started. So this morning we will talk about the challenges that face investigative journalism. We're going to ask our panel here, who represent some of the most prestigious and courageous news organizations around the world, to look into the near future, the time horizon of 3 to 5 years, and tell us about what they see in terms of both the challenges and opportunities that face investigative journalists and investigative journalism around the world. Thank you. I'll introduce the panel as I call them on to speak. So let me start with Marina Walker-Guevara, who is known to many of you. Marina is a pioneer in investigative journalism, and she is currently the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Network for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, of which many of you here are members. Marina managed both the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers investigations, among others. So Marina, tell us what you see in the next 3 or 5 years as in terms of both challenges and opportunities. There's a little bit of noise, and we're finding it. Can we please respectfully ask you to shut up, so that we can hear each other. This is a big hall. Yes.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you, everyone. How great it is to be here, despite all the jet lag and tiredness. Bear with us. We hope to make sense. I want to focus on one aspect that has preoccupied me, and I've had a privilege to reflect on in the past year on a fellowship at Stanford University, and it's the issue of artificial intelligence. And you know, when there's so much hype around AI, and when we can get past this kind of dystopia of the robot eating the human type of scenario, we actually discover that AI has a lot to offer to journalism in general, can be really transformative, but specifically to investigative reporting. If we look at AI as a tool that can help us solve journalistic problems we face, and those journalistic problems we face are the problems of big data. We come a long way with investigations like the Panama Papers, but also the Troika Landromat and Danske Bank, and so many investigations that would not have been possible without the help of technology, without technology really servicing our work. But that's the great news. We've done smart and clever things to aid the investigations with technology. The not so good news is that the process is not as efficient yet as it could be. We are still taking a long time. We are doing a lot of manual work, and the world out there is getting more dangerous. The news cycle is faster. we don't have as much time to spend. We have too many competing priorities. So the question is, how can we better use technology, and particularly machine learning, which is the subfield of artificial intelligence that can be really useful to journalism. So what is machine learning? Is, very, very basic. It's computing systems, it's math that help us interrogate, organize, and understand those messy data sets that we all deal with. Those moments that we find ourselves all the time. How am I going to make sense of these millions of images? How am I going to sort out these millions of documents or listen to all these audios that have been leaked to my newsroom? I like to cite the example of our colleagues in Ukraine, a group of journalists who recently, they wanted to sort out how to make sense of illegal amber mining in their country. And they knew that the answer was in satellite imageries, because they knew what the soil looks like when you damage it with illegal mining of amber. So they taught a computer, that's what machine learning is, what that pattern looked like. The pots and the holes and the shape. And the computer learned it, and then they ran that algorithm against millions of satellite imageries, and they were able to find a specific number, thousands of cases all through Ukraine where that situation, where that illegal mining had taken place. So that's an example of starting with an impossible story. How do we find out how the extent of the damage and turn it into a possible story we can manage? So to finish, just 3 quick things as we continue to think about how machine learning is going to transform our business. First of all, we all need to become literate in artificial intelligence. This is not just the realm of data journalists. And we need to do it because we need to be able to investigate the algorithms that are produced by others, by powerful people and institutions, and that are creating new forms of exclusion, of persecution, and discrimination. The second thing is AI is not perfect and it's not magic. It's not going to solve all of our problems, and it's not right for all the problems. Most of our data problems might be able to be solved with simpler things. So AI is a process, and it's a process that needs humans. It's not going to work on its own. So human-computer cooperation is going to be key. Computers are still pretty dumb. That's the reality. They don't get context, they don't get nuance. So the third thing comes directly from this one, and it is, if anybody was worried, AI is not going to replace any of us. At least I don't think it's going to replace investigative journalists. It's going to augment our capabilities so we can use our time better, looking for context, being in the field, and doing all the important parts. And we can let the computer take over the more tedious part of our research. There are many workshops in this conference about AI, several of them. So that would be a great place to start for many of you with all these concepts.
Thank you, Marina. Marina and our next speaker, Drew, run international collaborative investigative projects. So I'd like to ask Drew to weigh in. Drew, as many of you know, is the founder of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and also of an investigative reporting center in Bosnia. OCCRP has done award-winning work investigating crime and corruption in very, very difficult areas. So, Drew, what do you see in the next 3 to 5 years? Marina talked about artificial intelligence. Can you take that up and see what you see in that horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the next 3 to 5 years, I think, are going to be some of the most important we have faced in journalism in a long time. I mean, we've been roiling and we've been changing, but that change is only going to quicken. There's a lot of forces in the world that are working against us and for us. And I think the next 3 to 5 years is really where you're going to see some things happen that are going to change the next 20 years in journalism. First of all, collaboration has won. I think we can say that off the bat. If you're not collaborating with other news organizations, you're way, way behind the times. You know, we're working with more than 30 different news organizations in our projects right now, and if you're not leveraging the cheaper, better, and faster work of your partners, then you're losing ground. But you know, we are automating a lot of things. You know, you're seeing a lot of organizations, ICIJ, OCCRP, have developed kind of advanced knowledge management systems. In OCCRP's ALEF system, we have over 1 billion different entities now. And I would say between all the various efforts that are out there, there are tens of billions of entities that are being tracked by news organizations, including, you know, criminals, including assets of PEPs and all sorts of interesting information. As we collect more and more information, we're finding more creative ways of mining that information to find news stories. So we use ALEF as a tip sheet for journalists, you know, saying, oh, you know, this organized crime person you're interested in has just opened up shop in Moldova, which gives us the kind of tips we need to do our stories quicker and faster. And those are getting better. The other thing is people who do collaborative work know that the collaborative tools that are out there are quite frustrating. And, you know, we all have systems, but they don't really work that well. And I think the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see a revolution in collaborative tools so that people in remote locations can work more effectively together and to be more effective in how they do things, including searching the knowledge management systems. So these are all kind of tools. You know, some of them will use artificial intelligence, some of them will use other things, but they're all basically designed to kind of make us, you know, powerful reporters. You know, and I think that that's what's going to be critical in the future. Artificial intelligence is going to be a giant impact on our organization. There will be some people, especially in the daily news business, who find they're supplanted by algorithms that more effectively collect and distribute the news than they can. In the investigative side, it's not going to be as easy to do that. But given the stresses that we have, including increased autocracy around the world, the blockage of internet sites, the final piece of the puzzle that's really going to be important to us is how we interact with the audience. Many of us now are forced to interact through Facebook or Google or other tools, and we have to find more effective ways to directly deal with our readers and reach out to them and interact with them in meaningful ways as a means to get money and also the ways to get information, because I'm afraid if you look at in our part of the world, the trend, it's towards closing off information, and it's towards blocking information, and it's towards fracturing of the internet. And these are serious problems that are moving, I think, towards the West.
Thank you. You talk about tools, and the next 3 to 5 years we'll see what you call revolutionary developments in this field. I'd like to pose this question to Reg. Reg Chua is the global managing editor for operations of Reuters. What do you see? Forgive me, I'm asking the people who work in the international space first, and then we'll go region by region. But what do you see in this area of collaborative tools, artificial intelligence? What else does the international muckraking community need in order to face the challenges of the near future?
Thanks. So I think I was told to be the boring one here, and I'm ripping off both Marina and Drew, except in a much more boring way. And the reason is just that I can safely say of all the people in the room, I'm the least I least resemble investigative journalists. Mostly I'm a bureaucrat. Plus I'm Singaporean, so you can imagine how exciting that is. So I want to talk a little bit about plumbing, not actual plumbing, but metaphorical plumbing. And what do I mean by that? I mean all the systems that we run, right? And that Drew has referenced that, and Marina has referenced that. And this is the kind of stuff that helps us do better, more effective, more efficient, more collaborative work in the future. And like plumbing, we don't generally think about it until, you know, the toilet overflows, or we try to build extra floor in the building, and we realize that, you know, the water piping doesn't go there. So why does this stuff, and this is stuff like publishing systems, like CMSs, it's metadata, or what our stories are about, a digital security infrastructure, and just plain old management. So some of this matters more now because in the good old days, somebody else, usually somebody like me, worried about it for you, but now those good old days are gone, and now you all work in much smaller organizations, and frankly, you don't have time for this. You're all busy trying to think about what the next great story is, and you should be. But you also need to think about all of these systems, because if you don't, it brings more risk to your organization, and frankly, it can endanger your sources, and it can limit your growth. But it also matters, because of Sheila's 3 to 5 year question, because these are the foundations that let us reimagine what we can do. So let's just talk about CMSs for a second, right? For the most part, they work pretty well, but they're basically built around an old newspaper structure, which is, a dateline, a byline, a date, and then a big chunk of text. And if you want to write 8,000 words, that's great, and maybe you should be writing 8,000 words. But look at a site like Homicide Watch in the US, right? They decided to do 2 revolutionary things. One, they decided to cover every murder in DC, not just the newsworthy ones. And that already was a big deal, because it meant that they covered stuff that, that affected a mostly poor, mostly black community, and served them much better. And then the second thing they did was they decided to cover it not as stories, but as data. They databased the date, the time, the place of every murder, the gender and age of the victim, the alleged perpetrator, the investigating officer, the next court date. And because they did that, it meant that they could have access to a whole bunch of data. It meant they could interrogate the data in a very different way, and they could do stuff that without a FOIA request they couldn't otherwise do. But now WordPress, which is what most of the people in this room use, doesn't let you do that, right? You need a system that is engineered to let you do that, and so they built their own. It's a very simple one, but they built it, and it helped them reimagine how to do crime reporting. Or ICIJ, when you wanted to do collaboration around data, or CCRP, you basically built your own collaboration platform. So how should we be thinking about things like publishing systems to allow us to do things that we want to do? How can we be pushing companies like WordPress, because frankly, we're not very good at doing these things, to give us systems that will give us the way to reimagine news? Or metadata, as Drew pointed out, it's great when you can pull together billions of records together, but again, we don't do enough of that. We don't talk about common systems, common identifiers for data, because that, again, can give us a lot more things. Frankly, if you just look within your newsroom, people have got stuff in their notebooks that they don't necessarily share with other people, or have an easy way of sharing across a newsroom. We need those systems. What about our digital security, and not just about, do you as a journalist know how to use Signal or have 2-factor authentication? So what about your digital backbone? What about what about policies and about safety and security? There's just a lot of stuff that I think really comes down to things that are frankly not as sexy as great stories, not as sexy as AI, but frankly are things we just need to do. And this is going to be, I think, a really critical area for news organizations the next couple of years. It can sink us if we do it badly, but frankly, if we do it well, it really opens up all sorts of opportunities to do much, much better work.
Thank you. We've talked about, systems, tools, the infrastructure for making investigative reporting happen or make it better to meet the challenges of today. But there are more immediate challenges. And so I'd like to turn to Zafar Abbas, who's the editor of the influential English language paper Dawn in Pakistan. He's been the editor since 2010, and he's also the first chair of the Editors for Safety, which is a group of Pakistani news editors who have decided to organize themselves because they've been under siege from the government. Zafar himself has been under siege, most recently because of his role in the so-called Dawn leaks, where it's a complicated story, but it involves, of course, the Pakistani military. So I'd like to ask Zafar to talk about facing both these political threats and the business threats. What do you see in the next 3 or 5 years? Do we see these threats escalating, or do we see sort of a reassertion of the journalist's right to report and to stand up to governments?
The government is never going to give you any permission to do what we do, but we have to snatch it from the authorities and continue to do what we believe in. I see 3 distinct groups that are opposed to what we call investigative journalism. One is, of course, the state authorities, who never want the journalists to write or expose what they do not want the public to know. The second, of course, is the big business, which is always opposed to the idea of journalists going into details of how a company has made so much profit over a period of time without being transparent. And the third in countries like Pakistan are, and in many other countries as well, are the militant organizations or the ultra-right extremist groups or ultra-nationalist groups. All three elements have been opposed to the idea of exposés in journalism. At times, they also supplement each other. For instance, for the last 15, 20 years, we had been writing about that. These are the Islamist militant that are eating into the social fabric of our society, and the state institutions have to take action against them. We were accused of being unpatriotic and anti-nationalist. Now times have changed, and the government takes pride in saying there is no room for armed militancy in the country. And when we try to remind them that we are the ones who had been telling you for the last 15, 20 years to eliminate these people, we are again accused of being anti-nationalist and unpatriotic by not giving credit to the government or the state authorities. But then we are in the truth-telling business, Sheila. We cannot shy away from these things. As long as our facts are right, we have done our proper investigation, nobody can stop us from doing what we believe in doing, what we have been doing. We have done exposés. There are other journalists, my friends from other newspapers from Pakistan, who have done big exposés. They have been attacked through social media, direct action by the state authorities, attacks by militant organizations. But they are such brave journalists. They have continued to do their work. The coming years will be probably more difficult. Pakistan is going through an existential crisis where it has to decide whether to get rid of corruption and militancy at the same time is important, is doable or not, and our role becomes crucial in continuing to investigate where they are hiding the facts, where they are collaborating behind the scene, and I think if we continue to do our work properly, there is hope.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Katherine to talk about, both of you are in the front lines. Katherine Getcha is the country manager of Code for Kenya. She was the first woman news editor and investigations editor of the Nation Media Group, also in Kenya, and the founding editor of the Star newspaper in Nairobi. So Katherine, Zafar has talked about, political threats to journalism. Do you see that as the main problem in the countries that you work in? Or do you see more, problems about the sustainability of news as a business and the ability of journalists to continue working, under these very, very challenging financial conditions?
Hi. Okay, there are 3 things or 4 things I can see which are going to pose a challenge for media in Africa or in the global south. Obviously, the biggest one is sustainability because everybody's business model has collapsed. But on the other hand, it's also an opportunity for us, and I've seen in the continent quite a number of initiatives where different news organizations are trying to find ways of keeping themselves alive without necessarily depending on donor funding and or the usual advertising and everything. And this is coming out because of understanding what their audiences are. So one of the things is the biggest challenge, obviously, in terms of sustainability is getting to understand your audiences intimately and asking or getting them to work with you. Coming from a background where what people call free media is not the norm, I find a new and a huge opportunity, which I think will help us do the kind of work we want to do, which is online. And I don't mean online with your smartphone, guys, because most of us may not be on smartphones, but finding how we can collaborate internally. For example, if you're a TV journalist or if you're a radio journalist, how can we collaborate internally to do those kind of exposés my brother is talking about and reaching our audiences, because they are not all online. They are not on your smartphone. So those are opportunities I can see. And this whole new, I call it this shiny new things that we are talking about, AI and all the rest of it. It's fantastic if you can actually have the data. In some of our countries, for example, like in Kenya, we don't have all that kind of data. Then you can then be able to say, I'm going to be able to access and then do the kind of investigations we want. We actually have to start creating databases from scratch, which means learning some of the basics, which for many people would be a basic, which is how do you scrape data from a PDF? So you start building those databases. And I'm proud to say that quite a number of organizations working in the continent are trying to build those databases. Because even when it comes to applying AI, you need to do some humongous build-up of those data so that you can then apply machine learning to say, okay, these are the trends and whatever. If you don't have the building blocks, how are you going to apply AI? I love when people talk about it that way, and I'm not critiquing Marina or anyone, but I'm just saying going forward in terms of, from the perspective of where we are at, we will do these things at a different space or a different pace, but in a way that makes sense to our audiences, because at the same time, yes, all indications are we're getting more young people online, and most Africans are actually going online. But the problem is, what are they finding online? We need to be able to work collaboratively, internally within the continent as well as externally, to try and build up and come up with content that will actually enhance trust. The last thing I see as a challenge is essentially governments. They're not as stupid as we always think they are. Sorry to use that word, but I'm sorry to the minister here. I'm sorry. But governments are, in a way, getting to use technology against their people, and especially journalists. I think the fact that we're all connected is good, but it's also very bad because it means they can switch us off anytime they feel like. Yeah, and they've been doing that. I think there are examples about where governments just decide to shut the internet because I think they want to make sure we don't cheat at exams, but that's usually an excuse. But the possibility and the ability and the capability of using these technologies, which are supposed to make us better connected, more connected against us, I think that is going to be a huge, huge, huge challenge, especially going forward. We're going to have some countries in elections in the next 3, 5 years. I mean, most countries have had elections this year and last year. So in another 5 years, we'll have another bunch of countries having elections. And my concern, and any concern for any journalist or even investigation, is this capacity and this hunger and this willingness to shut down, and then nobody makes noise. It's as if you're fighting that war on your own. It's all been done elsewhere, but not really being able to bring it down to the level of the user, in this case, the reader or your audiences, to understand what this challenge, what happens when this happens. What happens, or what it means for them when the internet is shut down, for example. And this also comes from governments being able to access technology, which is then used against its own citizens. The last thing I want to say is simply this. Guys, you're talking about reporting in people who are autocratic. Talk to most of the African journalists here, and I think they will give you their own very personal examples of reporting autocracy, or people who think they're God's gift to every one of us. And the experiences I find, because my own experience is that I used to envy what was going on in the West, but right now I'm like, instead of you coming to tell us, we should come over there and tell you. Because what is happening in the West, what is happening in the Americas, what is happening in the UK, we've lived it. And we found innovative ways that mattered to us, that connected with our communities, that connected with our audiences, despite everything else. So in a way, it's kind of turning around and saying, what's the basic? What is it that is coming up and we need to address and talk to people? So can we have a conversation? Instead of you teaching me, can we teach you? Because we have lived the experience of reporting autocrats. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Perfect segue to Cordelia Mayor, who is editor at the national desk of Der Spiegel, whose headquarters are here. You could see it outside that huge building with Der Spiegel on over there. So, Cordelia, can you address some of these issues, like what's happening in the West and how we engage audiences, the arms race of technology, the state of journalism in the West or the North or wherever, from your point of view here in Hamburg?
Yeah, it was just perfect what my colleague said about the outreach to the audiences, because I don't want to talk about our stories, and as far for technology, probably all on our panel are more in a position to talk about that, probably more everybody in the audience. But I want to talk about the outreach we need to do as investigative journalists, and about the activists we have to be for our own cause. Because the two main issues I see are how do we sustainability finance our... Okay. How to sustainably finance our investigative journalism, that is expensive, and on the other hand, how do we deal with rising populism all over Western Europe? And I think we have a special take in that also because it really, and it is new to us. I don't know if... yeah. Well, my hate relationship with technology here it shows. So what is very important to us was, there's many things to be worried about with populism rising in Western Europe, but what is especially important to us as investigative journalists is their strained relationship with the truth. It is really endangering our work, I think, because if evidence doesn't mean anything anymore, we are really lost. So what we are seeing in Western Europe is a polarization of the audiences. There's one part of the audience who really see the importance of our work, who really see, and in a new way actually, how important investigative journalism, how important research is for the workings of a democracy. And I think it is our part as investigative journalists to tap into that, to really reach out to the audiences who are our friends, who really see the importance and really try to make that connections. And in the end, traditional news organizations need to do that in terms of how they address their audiences and how they make contact. I think there's many organizations that are smaller, that rely on new membership models, all very interesting. They are doing a great job in connecting with their audiences. But I think it's really important. It's nothing that can be sourced out to anybody else, to any marketing department, to anything. Because it is us who have to make the connection with the audience and to get into a dialogue and really get this reservoir of people who really believe in what we are doing into supporting us. That's part number one. And part number two, with the rise of populism and the polarization in the society, there's this other part. I can say the numbers for Germany, that's about 1/5 of the population, maybe even more, who don't trust journalism. There's a huge level of distrust. They call us lying press, which is an old Nazi term. They're saying, you don't report about the things that matter to me, all these kinds of things. And some of the people there are lost. We cannot reach them with any arguments anymore. But there's a lot of people we should and cannot give up on. So we have to reach out to critics and to the skeptics too. So I think one of the important things is to offer all forms of dialogue from the news organizations to really get into discussions with those people. And another big aspect is to go into schools. We have an initiative, very well-known investigative journalists in southern Germany. They are going into schools to educate students and teachers about how we work. They explain how painstakingly the process is of uncovering this information. So it's again, I know that some countries are further than others. I think in Finland, media literacy is a big subject taught in school. But again, we cannot source out this to any teachers or anything. I think we are, as a community, are called upon to do some of that work by ourselves, because what I see all over Western Europe is really an erosion of knowledge and an erosion of the believing in evidence. And that would be really that would be eroding the basis, but pretty much of all. So I think that is important, that with all our work we're doing, and I know how strenuous everything is, that we also take part in that kind of activism.
Thank you. One of the themes that nearly every speaker has talked about is the need to engage audiences more effectively. So I'd like to pose this question: is what, I mean, you talked about going to schools and directly in contact with people, but what tools do we have? I'm speaking also of like, how do we maximize our impact, the impact of our work? Not just the audience for our work, which is important, but also the impact of our work in terms of ensuring accountability in government, in companies, and in society at large. And the press is a powerful institution, but how powerful are we really, and what tools do we have in order to not just fight back, but to maximize the impact of the work that we do? It's a difficult question, I know, no easy answers, but Drew, I see that you are thinking. I can see the thought bubbles above your head. So
yeah, well, we've thought a lot about this issue because, I mean, really what it comes down to is, we're in a world where, in my world, it's propaganda. It's very difficult to distinguish news organizations from propaganda. And you've got fractured internets with some countries opting out or creating barriers. And then you have the new technology that's coming through, things like, the fourth generation bots will be able to pull all the information off the internet that you've ever posted and then make a cogent argument to you in an email on why you should support something or do something, and maybe even call you on the phone and talk to you back and forth, and you won't know it's not a human being. This is the kind of technology for manipulation that's being worked on quite heavily. And so, and everybody is doing news now. I mean, besides the aggregators like Google, you're going to find nation states doing news, you're going to find, companies doing news, and then you're going to get AI aggregating all this news and then giving you another version of it. And so there'll be so much news that who we are gets lost. And that's why really this relationship with the people is something we have to recommit ourselves to. The nonprofit world in investigative reporting will win out against the for-profit world. The for-profit world of investigative reporting will almost disappear, I'm afraid. And we will go back to what we do, which is a public service of the people. And that we have to re-establish that bond to the people. And we have to cut through all the misinformation and all the flack and all the garbage that's out there and say, we're here to help you do something. But we need tools to do that. That's not something that's easily done. We do that now through Facebook. Do we want Facebook being our medium for doing that? No. And that's really difficult to do, and that takes a lot of money to be that sophisticated. So it's a real challenge. It's an opportunity, but it's a real challenge.
well, okay, so let me ask Marina first. Drew talks of, when you talk about a challenge, are we talking about a technological arms race where we're trying to race against the disinformation machineries of big states and powerful governments? Mm-hmm. I think that is a very asymmetrical and uneven fight. Do we have what it takes to take on this disinformation sphere with the tools, with the technologies that are available to us?
I think that perhaps 5-10 years ago, when we were all lone wolves trying to tell these big stories on our own and for the most part missing the big stories, it would have been much more difficult. I want to reemphasize how long we have come in terms of our networks of collaboration, in terms of the ways in which we're working today. I had an enlightening moment, or a kind of like a really aha moment, talking to a big tech company recently. They have something called an envisioning center, where they envision what work is going to look like in 10 years. And they called, no surprise, a big tech company has never called me, and asked, they wanted to know how journalists are working today. And so I, happily told them what we do. This thing that we now consider almost normal, we share radically, we put our egos aside as much as we can, we share enormous amounts of documents and data, we mine it together, we have this kind of like a specialized crowdsourcing communities of journalists that are guaranteeing that every side of a story is going to be covered, from bringing voices and perspectives that were never part of investigative journalism before. And so I talk about all of this, and then I said, well, can you tell me what you are seeing? Because if your job is to anticipate what work is going to be like in 10 years, give me a tip. And they said, well, what we anticipate in 10 years is what you just told me you guys are doing, investigative journalists.
So we're ahead of the curve.
We're ahead of the curve.
Right.
And it's this radical sharing among not only inside a particular company, but across all kinds of sectors, across disciplines, and across organizations. So I think that we think about what our strength and how can we guarantee our impact is like we have to double down in those efforts. And as we go about our journalism, also think two things. What stories we are telling, picking our stories right, knowing that what we say no to is almost as important as what we say yes to, because there's overload of possibilities and stories. So what do we say no to is really important. And then embracing our role as journalists and the rigor of our profession, and not try to become something we are not. We are not advocates. We have to have great relationships with the advocacy community, but not become opposition of anything. It's a big temptation in these times, and I think it's part of the populist and the dictator playbook to harass a journalist and to corner a journalist to such extent that then there's like this self-fulfilled prophecy where the journalist starts to identify as opposition, and that's when it's all lost, in my opinion.
Raj, I know you want to say that the commercial for-profit media is not going to die in the next 10 years.
No, I was just going to commit suicide up on stage because it's done. Thank you. No, no, you're not. So, look, I just wanted to say a little bit about the. Marina's absolutely right. There's all sorts of new techniques for getting information, for doing better stories on more subjects that matter to people. But your question was about how do you reach people through all of this noise, and I think that essentially we have to just speak more personally to people. And the ICIJ model, the OCCRP model, has been very successful in that you took a huge, what could have been in the old days, a big set of data and did and do like 10 huge stories about what's happening in the world, but instead you distributed it across a lot of countries and a lot of audiences, which made it much more personal to those countries. We can take that down more and more steps, right? And just think through, and I realized this was hype when Google showed their voice-activated thing where, you call up the hairdresser and you're just talking to a machine. But think about all the ways you could reimagine stories where instead of, having an 8,000 chunk word of text, it's like, tell me what happened, and then what happened, and, and you can start tailoring stories to what people already know and what they, what they want to know more about. And so, yes, we don't have those technologies. Yes, there is an arms race, but there are tools out there that one way or another are going to reach people. We need to be in that space, or other people are going to get there to tell stories in a way that we can't tell.
So one way really is to create new tools to be able to engage people better, but what is the other half of the equation is, and I'd like to ask Zafar and Katherine here, is how do you fight back against disinformation and the delegitimation of the press and of what we do as journalists? I remember, World Press Freedom Day started in 1993, inspired by the declaration made by African journalists, the Windhoek Declaration in 1993, when all of these countries were coming towards democracy. And they said, our problems are state censorship, and the need, and we lack journalist organizations. So today, those problems are radically different because it's not state censorship so much as state flooding or the flooding of disinformation and propaganda. So very different challenges from what we had 20, 25 years ago. So how do we, is it enough to continue doing what we do, which is doing investigative reporting, holding the powerful to account, truth-telling to power? Does that suffice, or do we need to do other things? How do we fight back, and how do we preserve the spaces that we still have right now?
Okay, for those who don't know, Windhoek, Namibia, that was almost 28 years ago today, almost. Hey, that's a long time. Yes, the situation has changed dramatically. What we were afraid of then and what it is now that we're afraid of are very different. The time we were thinking in terms of, we never imagined the world would change so drastically in 2 decades. I think at that particular time we were more worried about having a pluralistic, distributed media where you have more than state media. With digital technology, anybody can broadcast, anybody can print, anybody can do just whatever. On legacy media, though, what has happened is that those opportunities on the digital platforms have still been, especially in countries which have introduced laws that make it difficult for people to work online. What has happened is that the technology my brother Drew is talking about disinformation and misinformation, a lot of it is happening not on Twitter, especially in my part of the world. It's actually happening on WhatsApp. And getting tools or getting people in there to know what is going on there is quite difficult, obviously. But what has been encouraging are the different attempts that have been made in different parts of Africa as well as Latin America, and this comes from collaborating again across borders, because we have the same problems. AI is up here, but right now is WhatsApp. How do we deal with it? Because that's where disinfo is happening. So what has been the different attempts that are being made by different organizations, including journalists, to try and, I don't call it policing, but try and respond to the misinformation in those spaces. The other thing also, we thought the biggest challenge, again, was governments. It still is governments, because now they're able to shut you down if they feel like. I thought raiding newsrooms was a particularly African thing until it happened in Australia. So there's a physical challenge. There is where journalists are arrested, they can be killed, and that has been happening. But the one which is very difficult, and this is where now I think in terms of getting the public with us to see why we need to continue and the kind of investigations that we're doing matter to them, is actually after the shock and awe, so many things have happened, so much money has been stolen, so much money has been put in some bank account somewhere. After all that, how do you personalize it, and where do we get that information so that the people see that what we're doing is not only good for us to share amongst ourselves, but it really matters to them. So a good example was the Panama Papers. It was interesting, but somebody will ask me let me talk about my grandmother. She asked me, so what? So what is the so what for the Kenyan? What is the so what to the person who has never even thought of finding out where this offshore island is? What does it mean to them? Why is it important that journalists collaborated to expose this? Why is it important for my colleague from Kenya, John Allen Namu, to expose the bad things that the county police, for example, are doing? It needs to be personalized, and the way to personalize it is in the spaces where our audiences are, whether it's on WhatsApp, make it short and sweet and shareable, or it's online, which is not going to be accessible to everybody because of data cost, but also working with civil society organizations where whose business it is to advocate for transparency, for good governance, for whatever. Make it their business to see, for me to continue doing this kind of thing, they need to take it the extra mile, which is what Marina was saying, become the advocates and continue doing their advocacy work. 28 years later, are we still facing the same problems? Yes, but in a more subtle way, not the obvious hit me on the head, kidnap me, kill me. There are instances there, but it's now more subtle, and we need to be a bit more wired. I don't know whether that's the word to use, the word wired, but we need to be a bit more connected with ourselves, amongst ourselves, because governments will never sit ground. They'll always take more. So we need to be ahead of the curve when it comes to trying to push back. And it's not a fight in Kenya or Africa only, it's collectively. The pushback is not happening in individual countries, it's happening on these platforms where we are all living. So it's no longer one country's problem.
Zafar, I want to ask you several questions. One is, you've seen the impact of your reporting, and that's probably one reason why you're being attacked. Like the Panama Papers investigations had profound impact in Pakistan. But second, also, you've innovated on ways which journalists can defend themselves, right? So talk about that, and talk about, how do we fight back against disinformation? You are a veteran in fighting against physical threats, but how do we fight against disinformation?
There are no easy answers for what you are asking. In the old-fashioned way, being in this profession for the last 39 years now, these new things that are appearing in the last 4 or 5 years of how the state is responding to serious and honest journalism, and the way a vicious campaign is started against a newspaper or other news outlets or individual journalists. For me, I'm at a loss. For instance, just to give you an example, 3 years ago when we did a big expose on how the military and the civilians have not been able to eliminate militancy, although publicly they have been taking that position. We at dawn came under vicious attack. In the past, it used to be a government contradiction, probably some restrictions on the newspaper. This time they use the social media platforms, the other platforms, section of the media to attack individual journalists, the newspaper, and it was really hurting. It was hurting to an extent that when my colleagues used to come to me to say that we should counter these attacks, and in an old-fashioned style, as to say, no, we are just journalists and continue to do the work we have been doing, and we are not in the business of entering into counter-propaganda. But now I realize that when the state wants to destroy a journalist or a journalism institution, they are very powerful unless you work out and create tools to counter these challenges. So I really don't know. I would like to know from other friends whether we should go into the business of countering the state propaganda or continue to do the kind of journalism that we believe in. I have failed in the sense that I continue to tell my colleagues, go on doing the good journalism that you believe in, and let the government use all kinds of tools to come after us. But now I realize that the government in some ways is succeeding in destroying good journalism in the country, and we have not been able to counter it properly, or at least I don't have the tools to counter it, or I don't know whether I should get out of that role of being just an investigative journalist or a good editor and start entering into politics of countering the state propaganda against myself. So I would like to know from my friends whether we should now improvise and adopt this role.
Does anyone want to weigh in on Zafar's question?
I mean, one thing that we've done, we get attacked a lot, and our individual partner centers get attacked. So we don't respond directly as the partner center, but the other centers will respond, and they basically support the organization that's being attacked. The organization that's being attacked doesn't really respond because it's not really effective and it looks defensive. So you just get a lot of friends to back you up and say this is unfair and this is wrong.
Marina?
And we talk a lot about like these threats from the states, but let's also remember the threats from the businesses, from the owners of the media that we all work for. We just had a great example, and some of you may have followed it at Le Monde. It's an important institution for journalism around the world, and they found themselves, the newsroom, in a situation where shareholding was changing, and they could any day find themselves owned by tycoons and other billionaires with little regard for freedom of the press. And so they joined in an unprecedented way the entire newsroom wrote a letter and basically demanded and got a lot of support from outside, but it was basically their unity, and they claimed their right, which is a historical right that Le Monde has as an organization that was founded by journalists themselves, to be able to, they have to approve those dramatic changes in shareholders. It was, when we heard about it, we were like, oh, good luck with that, because the shareholders themselves had to give them back that power. And guess what? They got it. They got it. And from now on, that newsroom will have the right to decline or to accept dramatic changes in shareholding in their media company. So that's also an amazing example of what can happen when we join forces, think out of the box in creative ways to counter these kind of attacks.
Cordelia, I think you were interested in weighing in on that issue, yeah?
Yeah, on what you said about the situation at dawn, I think it is important to counter the lies that are put out about you and your work, and I think it's worth it putting quite a bit of effort into that. But a lot of papers in Europe have put a lot of effort into countering myths that are put out by the populists about crimes being committed by refugees, these kind of things. It's for a lot of them it has been a frustrating experience, because you take these lies are put out there in like 15 minutes, and then you spend days and days and days countering it and putting together all the facts, but it doesn't have the effect that you hope for, because you made a perfect chain of arguments. You had the evidence, and then still it doesn't have the effect. So I think if you get into the business of verifying things, you can really get lost. I mean, you can do it if it's important from time to time, but it can be just an area where you get lost. And regarding your question, how do we reach people? I think it's important, and we haven't really talked about it a lot, is investigative journalism on the regional and on the local level. That's where people know journalists. That's where they know the politicians. That's where they know the business. And they see that the problem with you is that the government is attacking you. In Western Europe, the problem is that a large part of the population thinks the government and the media is one. And and they are sort of like, we are just doing what the government is telling us. So I think if there's good journalism on the local level, that's where it matters to people. And that is a problem. Even about, I mean, it seems when I hear the colleagues what they are facing, it's very good in Western Europe. But still, because of lack of resources, all the local papers, they have very small resources, and they're very lonely, the people who are doing investigative work on a local level. And we need to find ways. Some papers are already seeing this and strengthening founding units, but we need to strengthen that.
So I'd like to round up this conversation and end this panel by going, each of you, just one short thing. What is one bright thing in the horizon that you see? And I think, Zafar, you should start with the solidarity among the editors in Pakistan.
Yeah, Sheila, one small success that we had in our country was that Pakistan is one of those countries where more than 80 journalists have been killed in the line of duty in the last 15 or 18 years. What had been happening in our country was that because of the competition, business competition among the television companies, among the newspapers, they were not interested in if somebody from Dawn was attacked, so others were not even mentioning the name of the newspaper or the journalist, and same was happening with Dawn and others. So a few years back, we set up a group of editors of television companies and newspapers and said, listen, we have to come up with a solution to speak collectively against these attacks. And the motto was, attack on one is attack on all. The publishers and owners were not interested in what we were doing, but we had to persuade them, and we did succeed. It took us 6 months. So now what happens is, if a journalist is targeted in Pakistan, every newspaper, every television company immediately plasters the news, mentioning the name of that news organization, of the journalist, whether he's a remote, working in a remote district in the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan, or in Balochistan, or in Karachi. And that is a kind of success story that we have. So I believe if our journalist unions and editors association and others bodies can get united on this one point, whether the attack is coming from the state institutions, the intelligence agencies, the militant organizations, we speak with one voice, and probably we may have some success.
Thank you. So quickly, around the panel, just briefly, some bright thing you see in the horizon. Journalists getting together.
Bright thing in the horizon is, to me, is the democratization of investigative reporting. This used to be the privilege of a few large media organizations, even maybe like 10, 15 years ago, and mostly men, if we remember. And today it's a completely different field. And it's a field that is bringing all kinds of voices from all kinds of places like Burkina Faso, where there's like one female investigative reporter, but you'll never stop her, Sandrine. She's a force of nature. So we need to continue building that diversity in our field.
Yeah, thanks. Cordelia?
Two brief things. One, I think also cooperation. It's not in the big networks only, but we have ad hoc cooperations, and people are seeing that even if you work with your direct commercial competitor, if you work with a non-profit journalistic organization, it really works. It increases the impact if you work together. So that's one really big thing. And another one, I think, is seeing the reporting on the Me Too issues and the team at the New York Times, and probably in many countries we have seen cases like that. And it changes a little bit, like, who is an investigative reporter? Is this just the person going after the big corruption cases, or can investigative reporting have kind of different face? And that broadens the field and is important.
Great. Yeah.
Two really quick things. One, the fact that we're even having this conversation. I mean, 5, 10 years ago, I don't think there was the same sort of thought about what the future is and how we need to change. And while we're not there, I think we've really moved along. And then the second quick thing, very personal, is a year ago in Seoul, we got on stage because Wallon and Choso, our reporters in Burma, were in jail, and now they're out. So, hey, that's a win.
And unfortunately, in Baku right now, there's one of a journalist for Maidan TV who's on a hunger strike. He was kidnapped from Georgia and dragged to Azerbaijan, where he's jailed. But despite all these difficulties, I still see passion. I see passion in the people who want to do this, and that's what I'm happy about.
Thank you. Katherine?
Happy about one thing, that we've come to the realization that whatever technology is required, we can be able to adapt it, and we are adapting it to suit our different circumstances, to be able to do the kind of reporting and supporting that we actually do need, internally as well as externally. Internally meaning within the continent, and externally with the rest of the world. Because until and when we are able to fashion and adapt that which is there to suit our very, very different